The room was silent except for the sound of my father's breathing. He slid a folder across the polished mahogany table, his eyes cold and calculated, and said words I'll never forget. "Sign the transfer. All $9.8 million to your sister." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I didn't flinch. My mother sat beside him, her face a mask of righteous authority, while my sister Karen fidgeted nervously in the corner, pretending this wasn't about her at all. The truth was, they'd called this a family discussion, but it felt more like an execution, and I was the one tied to the chair. I stared at the papers, watching the numbers blur together while my heart pounded against my ribs. They wanted me to hand over everything: the inheritance, the trust, the dignity my grandmother Eleanor had fought to secure for me. "It's only fair," my mother added, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Karen needs this more than you do. You've always been the strong one." Betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth, sharp and metallic, but I kept my face neutral. I'd learned long ago that showing emotion in this family was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. My father leaned forward, his voice dropping to that tone he used when he expected obedience without question. "This isn't a negotiation. You've had more than enough opportunities in life. Your sister deserves her chance." The humiliation of it all settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and dark. They were treating me like a child who didn't understand money, like someone who couldn't possibly grasp the weight of what they were asking. But I understood perfectly. They wanted revenge for every time I'd succeeded where Karen had failed. Payback for being the daughter who didn't need their validation. Karen finally spoke up, her voice trembling with manufactured vulnerability. "Please, I just want what's fair. You've always had everything." The lie hung in the air between us, so obvious it was almost laughable. I'd worked for every single thing I had while she'd been handed opportunities on silver platters, only to squander them with careless hands. The family drama that had simmered beneath the surface for years was finally boiling over, and I was expected to be the sacrifice that restored their twisted version of balance. Shamed for my success, mocked for my independence. This was the karma they thought I deserved. My mother's hand shot forward suddenly, her palm striking the table inches from my face, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Don't you dare sit there with that look on your face," she hissed. "Sign the papers." Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional composure cracking just enough to reveal that this meeting had crossed a line: legal, ethical, human. The dignity I'd been clinging to threatened to shatter, but I held on, feeling the shock of the moment settle over me like ice water. This was the moment everything changed. The moment I realized that the people who were supposed to protect me were the ones who'd backstabbed me most deeply. Infidelity to family bonds, cheated out of basic respect. They'd lied to themselves about who I was for so long that they'd started believing their own fiction. I took a slow breath and looked up, meeting my father's eyes with a calm that seemed to unsettle him. "Before I do anything," I said quietly, "I have a question for the lawyer." Mr. Harrison, who'd been sitting in the corner like a silent witness to this disaster, straightened in his chair. My father's face darkened with impatience, but I didn't care any more about his temper or his timeline. Something was about to shift, something they hadn't prepared for, and the shocking truth was about to emerge from the shadows where it had been waiting all along. Growing up, I learned that love in my family came with conditions I could never quite meet. Karen was the golden child, the one whose every achievement was celebrated with dinner parties and proud phone calls to relatives who barely knew our names. I was the backup plan, the sturdy one who didn't need attention because I was naturally capable. The vengeance I felt toward this invisible hierarchy wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like a wound that never quite healed. Every birthday where her gifts were extravagant while mine were practical, every report card where her B's were praised while my A's were expected, taught me that my worth was measured in how little space I took up. I remember being 8 years old, watching my father beam at Karen's mediocre piano recital while he'd missed my debate championship because of a work emergency. The betrayal felt enormous then, though I didn't have the words for it. I couldn't believe that two children from the same parents could be treated so differently, like we existed in parallel universes with completely different rules. My mother would stroke Karen's hair and call her, "my sweet baby," while I got efficient pats on the shoulder and reminders to set a good example. The truth was settling into my bones even then. I wasn't the daughter they wanted. I was the daughter they needed to make their favorite look better. Family drama became the wallpaper of my childhood, so constant I almost stopped noticing it. When Karen failed her college entrance exams, I was told to tutor her instead of preparing for my own scholarship interviews. When she crashed the car they'd bought her for her 16th birthday, I was asked to share mine, which I'd saved for with 2 years of part-time work. The justice I craved wasn't about revenge or payback. It was simply about being seen as a human being, with my own dreams and limitations. But asking for fairness in that house was like asking water to flow uphill. It simply wasn't part of the natural order they'd established. I learned to be silent, to swallow my disappointment like bitter medicine, to smile through the humiliation of being introduced as our responsible one, while Karen was our creative spirit. Self-worth became something I had to manufacture entirely on my own, without mirrors or reflections from the people who should have shown me my value. I was cheated out of the childhood most kids take for granted, where parents celebrate you for existing, not just for being useful. The lies they told themselves about equal love and fair treatment were so convincing that sometimes I wondered if I was the crazy one for noticing the difference. But my grandmother Eleanor saw everything. She never said much, just watched with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. After particularly bad family dinners where I'd been ignored or dismissed, she'd pull me aside and whisper, "Strength isn't about taking what they give you, sweetheart. It's about knowing what you deserve." I didn't understand what she meant back then, didn't realize she was planting seeds that would take years to grow. The dignity she modeled was quiet but unbreakable, the kind that didn't need external validation to exist. She was reclaiming her voice in subtle ways, teaching me to do the same without either of us speaking it out loud. Years passed, and the pattern continued like a script we'd all memorized. Karen dropped out of 3 colleges, each time returning home to comfort and reassurance while I was putting myself through graduate school with scholarships and midnight shifts. The infidelity to basic fairness was so normalized that pointing it out felt like breaking an unspoken family rule. I was backstabbed so consistently that I stopped expecting anything different, stopped hoping they'd wake up one day and see me clearly. But something was building beneath the surface, something my grandmother had been carefully constructing in legal offices and lawyer meetings I knew nothing about. The shocking truth was that while I'd been learning to survive, she'd been preparing me to do something far more powerful. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in spring, surrounded by flowers she'd requested instead of family members she didn't trust with her final moments. I was the one she called when she needed rides to doctor appointments, when she wanted company for afternoon tea, when the loneliness of being the only honest person in a dishonest family became too heavy. My parents visited out of obligation, Karen out of guilt. But I came because she was the only person who'd ever made me feel like I mattered for who I was, not what I could provide. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a letter from her attorney, Mr. Harrison. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Eleanor had been meeting with him for over a decade, carefully restructuring the family trust that my grandfather had established before he passed. The truth was, she'd seen the pattern long before I'd had words for it, recognized the family drama for what it really was, systematic favoritism that would destroy one daughter while spoiling the other. She'd watched my parents promise equal inheritance while quietly shifting resources toward Karen, watched them lie to themselves about loving us the same while their actions screamed otherwise. Eleanor's plan wasn't cruel. It was precise, surgical, and rooted in justice rather than payback. She'd given my parents enough rope to hang themselves, documenting every financial irregularity, every loan to Karen that was never expected to be repaid, every investment opportunity steered away from me and toward my sister. The dignity with which she operated was stunning. She never confronted them, never caused a scene, just quietly gathered evidence like a detective building an airtight case. She knew that consequences don't always arrive on their own schedule. Sometimes they need a gentle push from someone who understands the law. The revelation came in paragraph 7 of the trust documents. Eleanor had transferred decision-making authority to me 5 years before her death. Not just advisory power, not just a voice at the table, but complete legal control over the assets my parents had been treating as their personal checking account. She'd been testing them, I realized, giving them chances to course correct, to recognize their favoritism and address it. Instead, they doubled down, becoming more obvious in their bias, more careless in their financial manipulation. Every dollar they'd promised Karen, every plan they'd made for redistributing the family wealth, required my signature, a signature they didn't even know they needed. Mr. Harrison's letter explained that Eleanor had been tracking financial inconsistencies for years. Money that was supposed to be split equally was somehow always benefiting one daughter over the other. Properties that were meant to be held in trust were being quietly retitled. What they'd been doing wasn't just emotionally damaging, it was financial, legal, and meticulously documented in folders that Eleanor had labeled with dates and notarized statements. She'd been watching her own daughter perpetuate the same favoritism she'd fought against in her own childhood, and she'd decided that silence wasn't strength, preparation was. In her final letter to me, handwritten on her favorite stationery that smelled faintly of lavender, Eleanor wrote, "They mistook your quietness for weakness, your patience for permission. Show them what reclaiming your voice really means." I sat in my apartment, holding that letter, understanding for the first time that every conversation we'd had, every legal document she'd asked me to witness, every casual question about my future plans had been building toward this moment. What my parents had been doing wasn't going to be answered with screaming or drama. It was going to be answered with documents, legal precedent, and the kind of justice that doesn't require raised voices. My grandmother had seen everything, understood everything, and prepared me for a confrontation I didn't even know was coming. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, and the room's energy shifted like air pressure before a storm. My father glared at me with barely contained rage, clearly viewing my request to speak to the lawyer as another delay tactic, another example of my supposed selfishness. "This is a family matter," he snapped, "not a legal consultation." But the lawyer was already straightening his papers, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal something that looked almost like anticipation. I couldn't believe how perfectly this moment was unfolding. How every second of my grandmother's preparation was leading to this single question that would shatter their entire illusion of control. "Mr. Harrison?" I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Who currently holds legal authority over the family trust?" The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stopped fidgeting. My mother's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup, and my father's face cycled through confusion, irritation, and then something that looked dangerously close to fear. The moment he was about to experience, the realization that his assumptions were built on sand, hadn't quite registered yet. But I could see it coming like a train in the distance, inevitable and unstoppable. Mr. Harrison looked directly at my parents, and I watched understanding begin to dawn in his eyes. They genuinely didn't know. "That's an excellent question," he said slowly, opening his briefcase with deliberate precision. I was under the impression that this meeting was convened with full knowledge of the current legal structure. What my grandmother had orchestrated wasn't about punishment. It was about revelation, about forcing people to confront what they'd been avoiding. Every document he pulled out felt like another nail in the coffin of their carefully constructed fantasy. My father's voice had an edge of panic now, though he was trying to hide it behind bluster. "What are you talking about? We called this meeting to handle the transfer. Just tell her to sign the papers." But Mr. Harrison was shaking his head, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite satisfaction. It was closer to vindication, to years of being overlooked finally completing their circle. The truth was spreading across the table in the form of legal documents, each one a small bomb that would detonate my parents' assumptions about power, control, and their right to make decisions about assets they no longer commanded. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Mr. Harrison said, his tone professional, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been justice. "The authority to make decisions about these assets was legally transferred 5 years ago." He paused, letting that information sink in, watching my parents' faces as they processed what he was saying. They hadn't been acting with authority. They'd been acting on assumption. The family drama that had defined my entire childhood was about to be recontextualized, reframed through a lens of legal reality rather than emotional manipulation. I sat perfectly still, my dignity intact with every second of their growing confusion. My mother found her voice first, shrill with disbelief. "Transferred? To whom? We're the parents. We have authority over family assets until we're gone." But even as she said it, I saw recognition beginning to flicker in my father's eyes. He was starting to remember conversations with Eleanor, meetings he'd been too busy to attend, documents he'd signed without reading, because his mother had always handled the boring legal stuff. The lies they'd told themselves about control were unraveling in real time, and the most shocking part was how calmly it was happening. Mr. Harrison's next words would change everything. Mr. Harrison slid a folder across the table, not toward my parents, but toward me. "Decision-making authority over the trust, including all $9.8 million in liquid assets and associated properties, currently rests with your daughter," he said, nodding in my direction. The look on my parents' faces was almost artistic in its completeness, shock and denial and rage mixing into an expression I'd never seen before. Karen's mouth actually fell open, her carefully practiced vulnerability evaporating into genuine confusion. I couldn't believe how satisfying it was to watch their certainty crumble, not because I wanted revenge, but because the truth was finally being spoken out loud. My father grabbed the folder, his hands shaking as he flipped through pages of legal documents, each one bearing Eleanor's signature, notary stamps, and dates that went back years. "This is impossible," he muttered. But his voice had lost its authority, become hollow and desperate. What was happening was poetic. The man who'd spent my entire childhood wielding power through intimidation was suddenly powerless, reduced to reading words he didn't understand about decisions that had been made without his input. Every page he turned revealed another layer of my grandmother's careful planning, another instance where she'd quietly shifted control away from the people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with it. "Eleanor made these changes gradually, Mr. Harrison explained, his tone almost gentle now, like a doctor delivering a difficult diagnosis. "She documented concerns about financial irregularities, unequal distribution of resources, and what she termed systematic favoritism in her statements to the court." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or dismiss. My mother's face had gone white, then red, then white again, cycling through emotions too fast to track. What they were experiencing wasn't my doing. It was the natural consequence of years of dishonesty catching up with them in the most official way possible. I finally spoke, pulling my own set of documents from the bag I'd brought. Copies of everything, organized by date and category, each one highlighting the pattern that had defined my relationship with my family. "Exhibit A," I said quietly, sliding a paper toward my father. "The college fund that was supposed to be split equally, but somehow Karen's portion was triple mine. Exhibit B, the loans she received that were never meant to be repaid, all coming from trust assets that were supposed to be preserved for both of us." The clarity of it all, laid out in numbers and dates, left no room for the emotional manipulation they usually relied on. Karen started crying, but they weren't the manipulative tears she usually deployed. These were real. The sound of someone realizing they'd been complicit in their own infantilization. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know the structure, only the benefits." Whether she was talking about the money or the favoritism or the legal mechanisms that had been protecting her from consequences, The truth was, she'd never questioned why everything came so easily. My parents sat in stunned silence. What they'd orchestrated for decades suddenly revealed as something far uglier. Documented, systematic, legally actionable discrimination against one of their own children. What I felt in that moment wasn't about being superior. It was about finally, after 32 years, being seen as someone whose rights mattered. Mr. Harrison pulled out the final document, the one that would cement everything. "Your mother," he said to me, "has been operating under the assumption that she could continue managing these assets as she saw fit. But per the executed trust documents, any transfer, sale, or redistribution requires your explicit, written consent." He turned to my parents. "You don't have permission to ask her to sign anything. Legally, she holds sole discretionary authority." What had characterized my childhood was now being answered with the most powerful weapon available. Legal documentation that couldn't be argued with, manipulated, or dismissed. They'd been caught by their own arrogance, their certainty that I would always comply, always bend, always sacrifice what was mine for the comfort of others. I didn't shout, didn't gloat, didn't deliver the dramatic speech they probably expected. Instead, I simply stood up, gathered my documents, and said, "I'll need time to review the family's financial requests and determine what's appropriate moving forward." The look in my father's eyes was complete now. He'd realized that the daughter he'd trained to be invisible had been learning, watching, preparing for this exact moment. My mother tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. But nothing came out except a small, choked sound that might have been my name. What I'd imagined as a child. Screaming matches, exposing their hypocrisy in front of relatives, making them feel what they'd made me feel, seemed shallow now compared to this. The real power was in the silence, in the calm restoration of boundaries, in the simple act of using the word no, backed by legal authority they couldn't circumvent. Mr. Harrison gathered his papers with professional efficiency, avoiding eye contact with my parents in a way that spoke volumes about whose side he was on. What Eleanor's plan demonstrated was quietness, precision, and complete lack of emotion masquerading as care. Within a week, the consequences began unfolding like dominoes I'd never have to touch. Karen called me 17 times in 3 days, her voicemails cycling between apologetic and desperate, finally landing on angry when she realized I wasn't going to rescue her from the reality of her situation. My parents discovered that the credit cards they'd been using, funded by the trust, were no longer active, that the country club membership they'd charged to family expenses had been canceled, that the vacation property they'd promised Karen was in my name and had been for 5 years. Almost nothing they thought they controlled was actually theirs to control. I froze the accounts systematically, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Every penny my parents had spent on Karen's failed business ventures, every loan that had been forgiven, every expense that had been justified as family investment needed to be accounted for, documented, potentially reconciled. Their financial favoritism was being tallied in spreadsheets and bank statements, the evidence calculated in exact dollar amounts that couldn't be dismissed as emotional exaggeration. My father tried calling from different numbers, leaving messages that ranged from commanding to pleading to vaguely threatening, but I let them all go to voicemail. The most satisfying part wasn't watching them scramble. It was watching them face accountability for the first time in their adult lives. My mother had to cancel the elaborate anniversary party she'd been planning, the one that would have been funded by trust assets she no longer had access to. Karen had to move out of the apartment I'd been unknowingly subsidizing for 3 years. Her lifestyle downgraded from champagne brunches to roommate situations and budgeting apps. What had sustained itself on my silence was collapsing without the fuel of my compliance, and I didn't have to do anything except maintain the boundaries Eleanor had legally established for me. But what I cared about most weren't the financial changes. They were the relational ones. My parents couldn't call family meetings and expect me to attend. They couldn't make demands and expect compliance. They couldn't distribute my inheritance to their favorite child and expect me to smile through it. The truth was settling into everyone's bones. I wasn't the backup plan anymore. Wasn't the strong one who could handle anything. Wasn't the invisible child who existed to make their golden one look better. I was taking back everything they'd taken, not through violence or cruelty, but through the simple, powerful act of saying no and having the legal authority to make it stick. My father showed up at my apartment on a random Tuesday evening, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. No entourage, no lawyer, no mother standing behind him with her arsenal of guilt and manipulation. Just him, standing in my doorway with the kind of exhaustion that comes from having your entire worldview dismantled in a matter of weeks. I couldn't believe he'd come alone, without the armor of authority he'd always worn like a second skin. What he must have felt, discovering that his power had been an illusion for 5 years, had clearly broken something fundamental in him. "Can we talk?" he asked, and his voice was different, stripped of the commanding edge I'd grown up obeying without question. I let him in, not out of forgiveness, but out of curiosity, wanting to see what a man looked like when he finally confronted the truth about himself. We sat in my small living room, the silence stretching between us like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. What this moment represented wasn't in my hands. It was in his, in whether he chose honesty or continued the lies he'd been telling himself for decades. He started with the usual deflections, the explanations about Karen needing more support, about me being naturally capable, about family obligations and sacrifices we all have to make. But watching him try to justify the unjustifiable was like watching someone dig a hole they couldn't climb out of. "Stop," I finally said, and the word carried more weight than any speech I could have prepared. "I don't need the story anymore, Dad. I know what happened. The question is whether you do." How his face crumpled at that was startling. All the bravado finally, completely giving way to something that looked almost like shame. "I thought I was being a good father," he said quietly. And for the first time in my life, I heard actual uncertainty in his voice. "Karen was struggling, and you were thriving, and it seemed like the right thing to balance it out, to give her extra support so she could catch up." What he was describing, this idea that love should be rationed based on performance rather than distributed freely, was so deeply ingrained he didn't even recognize it as wrong. But I could see him starting to question it now, see the foundation of his beliefs beginning to crack under the weight of their consequences. "You didn't balance anything," I told him, and I kept my voice calm, factual, free of the emotion that would let him dismiss this as overreaction. "You taught Karen that she'd always be rescued, that consequences were optional, that effort didn't matter because you'd always cushion her fall. And you taught me that I was only valuable when I was useful, that asking for help was weakness, that love was something I had to earn by being perfect and invisible." What his parenting philosophy had created was sitting in front of him in the form of 2 daughters, one who couldn't function without constant support, and one who'd learned to function completely without him. He sat with that for a long time, and I watched him age in real time, the weight of his choices finally settling on his shoulders where it belonged. "I mistook authority for responsibility," he said finally, and it was the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. "I thought controlling the money meant I was taking care of the family. I didn't realize I was destroying it. What I'd fought so hard to reclaim was filling the space between us, and I realized that I didn't need his apology or his understanding. What I needed was for him to stop expecting me to sacrifice myself on the altar of his poor decisions, and whether he could do that remained to be seen." The months after that conversation brought changes I'd been too afraid to even imagine before. My relationship with my parents didn't magically heal. Real life isn't a movie with convenient redemption arcs and tearful reunions. But it shifted into something more honest, more boundaried, more real. My mother still struggled to accept that her golden child narrative had been dismantled by legal documents and consequences, but she stopped calling me with demands disguised as requests. What she felt about Eleanor's deception slowly gave way to reluctant understanding that maybe, just maybe, there had been reasons for it. Karen and I found an unexpected middle ground. She'd been as damaged by the favoritism as I had, just in different ways. She'd never learned resilience, never developed self-sufficiency, never discovered who she was without the constant validation of parents who'd loved her to death. We started meeting for coffee, carefully at first, navigating the minefield of our shared history with the caution of people who'd been wounded by the same war. What I could have done, rubbing her face in her dependency, gloating about my newfound power, felt hollow compared to the possibility of actually knowing my sister as a human being rather than a rival. I didn't restore their access to the trust funds, but I didn't cut them off completely either. What Eleanor had set in motion wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability, about forcing people to live within actual means, rather than means they'd assumed would always be available. I created structured allowances, established budgets, required transparency for any requests. My father got a part-time consulting job at 63, something he'd never imagined needing. My mother actually tracked expenses instead of swiping cards connected to an apparently infinite resource. Karen enrolled in a professional certification program and got a job that didn't involve family connections. What I felt wasn't about their reduction. It was about my expansion. I could make decisions about my career without worrying about drama. I could travel without guilt. I could invest in my own future without the constant background noise of, "But what about your sister?" Their actions had come full circle, but hadn't destroyed them, just forced them to become adults who understood that resources were finite and choices had consequences. The feeling that had defined my childhood was fading, replaced by something I'd never expected: peace. My sense of worth stopped being contingent on their approval or disapproval. I learned that finding your voice doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like a calm no. Sometimes it looks like enforcing boundaries without explaining them. Sometimes it feels like choosing your own happiness over someone else's comfort. What I'd experienced taught me what true family actually looked like. People who saw you, valued you, supported you without requiring you to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. I found that family in friends, in mentors, in communities I built for myself rather than ones I'd been born into. Eleanor's gift wasn't just the money or the legal protection. It was the lesson that silence could be strength when you're preparing, that invisibility could be power when you're learning, that being underestimated was an advantage when you knew what you were actually capable of. What I'd been denied my whole childhood, that I mattered, that I deserved, that I was enough exactly as I was, became the foundation of everything I built afterward. I didn't triumph over my family in some dramatic confrontation. I simply stopped letting them define me, stopped waiting for their recognition, stopped believing that their limitations were somehow my responsibility. And in that quiet process of reclaiming myself, I found something they'd never given me: freedom. So here's what I want to know. Have you ever been the invisible child in your own family? The one who was expected to be strong, silent, and self-sacrificing, while someone else got all the love, support, and second chances? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not alone in this. Maybe you experienced that moment when you realized the family drama wasn't about love at all. It was about control. Or maybe you're still waiting for your moment, still wondering if accountability will ever catch up with the people who hurt you. Here's what I need you to understand. Consequences don't always arrive on schedule, but they arrive. The truth eventually surfaces, no matter how many lies are piled on top of it. Your worth isn't something anyone can take from you permanently. It's something you can reclaim, even after years of being treated as invisible. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you suddenly had the power to enforce boundaries with family members who'd spent your whole life treating you like you didn't matter? What's the one thing you wish you could say to the people who denied you basic fairness and respect? And if this story resonated with you, if it touched something raw and real that you've been carrying around without words for it, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and smash that notification bell, because we're not done talking about family dynamics, vindication, and the complicated path to healing. We're diving deep into the stories nobody else wants to tell, the ones about what happens when the invisible child finally becomes visible, When the backup plan refuses to play that role anymore. When silence transforms from weakness into strategic power. Your experience matters. Your story deserves to be heard. And I'm here to make sure we create a space where truth doesn't have to whisper anymore. Hit that subscribe button. Join this community. And let's keep exposing the realities that too many people are forced to navigate alone.